Good morning, class. Okay, let's start with the concept of geopolitics. We start geopolitics as the study of the intrinsic relation of power between the political actors, which include states, international organizations, NGOs, corporations, and even individuals in their relation and interaction with the geographical environment, which is Earth, okay, in which these actors develop and form themselves and their institutional lives. Geopolitics is a discipline inside the international relations worldview. I want to get this clear. There are at least two concepts that we can call as foundational myths of the world order, realist, if you want to call it, as they call themselves, international relations schools, that are based basically on two myths. Myths are beliefs that are widely believed as true, but they are not proven to be scientifically true. And one is about the anthropological pessimism that basically affirms that the human nature of human being is negative. And from that point of view, we have constructed in this geopolitical so-called realist school an international arena where all the political actors are basically, their function is to survive and to try to control, manipulate via the resources they have available other actors, in order always in a situation of mutual distrust and of self-centered interest. This is very important to have in mind, because this is the worldview that rules today the world order. It's like the rule, okay? And as I want to leave this clear, these are based on myths that are the foundation of basically all the institutions that rule today's world order governance system, okay? So having these two, about international anarchy, I want to say also that this, basically it points that, it says that there is no hierarchical order between the actors, okay? So we live in this kind of anarchy where the most strong, at least the way we think today, is the one that can do whatever he wants, okay? That's having this basic concept of geopolitics in mind, I want to make a very important distinction for the rest of the class, and that's been across all the course that Ivan is given. That's the distinction between Earth as a planetary system and the world order as a system. Earth, as the Earth sciences study, it's a complex and dynamic interdependence of thousands of variables that could be studied in different spheres, as the Earth science do. Obviously, I'm not an expert on this, but we know that science is applied into Earth, and it's giving us all the information we have about today's Anthropocene scenario situation. And what I want to point out is that Earth is an independent organism from humanity, okay? We live inside Earth. And this might sound like something that's logical, but we don't have really this distinction made in the world order. So we tend to mix the concept of planet Earth with the world. And what the world really is, in at least this definition and this distinction of concepts, the world is the historical creation of humanity in Earth. So the world is our culture, is our economic and socio and political systems, the things that we have created to organize ourselves inside the planet, okay? So to have this distinction in mind, it's important to understand what we're trying to say about the geopolitics of climate change and what it implies. So, as you've been seeing in the classes before, the anthropogenic effects of climate change, the anthropogenic climate change, it's the most obvious and urgent issue that the Anthropocene is presenting to humanity as a whole. With this, we want to point out that the new circumstances that the Anthropocene brings to humanity, it's an open invitation for us to start rethinking the worldview that we have, the geopolitics of the situation. Because this, if we think that all the causes, or the main causes of climate change is our activity in the planet and how it affects, how we affect the planetary system, it start to think what took us into this situation that's becoming or became an issue. So what we're trying to do during this class is to see 3 different scenarios that we can get into if we basically do nothing or we keep business as usual. We will see the IPCC scenario of not getting more than 2 degrees from pre-industrial era into 2030, or a potential hothouse effect scenario. That's the worst case scenario that could be developed during this century if we do nothing. And then we will think about a possible, a probable scenario if we start rethinking, really rethinking the way we see ourselves and how we relate to the world and to the planet, to humanity and the planetary system. The concept of global risks, it's important for us to understand the geopolitics of climate change. Because as you can read there, in the World Economic Forum definition, in the report of last year, it's defined as an event that causes significant negative effects to many countries over a period of at least 10 years. And this already makes the climate change a global risk, since it's been affecting our planetary system and the world for at least more than 10 years. And it will be affecting us, or even in the physical, planetary, and in the world for the next 10 years or even more, a century of changes. There are some modelings that announce that even the current situation, for at least 500 years, we will have effects of the climate change we are already seeing with, for instance, the melting of the polar, like the Antarctica will be like melt from here to 2500. So let's keep that times in our mind. But there are 2 aspects of the global risk definition that are very, very related to climate change. That it's the global risks are they have a systemic nature, just as climate change, and there's a strong uncertainty related to the phenomenon. Like, we can't model precisely what will happen. We can have, because of earth sciences, I quote them again, we can have some models by analyzing the variables of earth, but it's unpredictable in one point. So these are all aspects that we have in mind when we talk about climate change as a global risk. it's interesting to see how all the issues that we face today, all the risks that we face today are interrelated. They are like a map of issues. And if we see in the center of it, we have the pillar of climate change mitigation and adaptation. It's not coincidence that in the center of the map, okay, and large-scale involuntary migration, as we will see that it's very related to one of the effects of climate change. And from here, I want you to connect with Patricia's last class and how she talked about the climate governance, how institutions are trying to deal with the issue of climate change. And from this, I want to share my thought that in the last 30 years, all the international environmental regimes that tried to face the different situations that were that coming around with climate change specifically, were not very successful, as we are seeing, like having the Paris Agreement in 2015, trying to get the greenhouse gases getting down, and what we are seeing is that they are growing bigger until the COVID-19 situation. That is also showing us something interesting about how we and our way of living is producing the pollution, the gases that create the problem that we are facing. So it's important to have all of that in mind. And the other thing that we can see throughout these reports, this one is from this year, is that the likelihood and impact of the environmental risk with climate change in the head of all these risks had been, during the years, especially in the last 5 years, gaining importance inside the global agenda of likelihood of impact of this environmental risk in the next 10 years. So as you can see here, it's almost all green, besides some geopolitical risks and societal risks that are also related to climate change. So keep all of this in mind. Keep all of this in mind, we can define climate change as the most important global risk of today. From this point, we go very, very fast throughout the Earth effects of climate change, as you've seen in lessons before, the classes before with Ivan and Patricia. We have one first possible scenario of not getting more than 2 degrees until the 2030. That's are the recommendations of the IPCC, as you've seen before. And this is unstoppable and uncertain scenario, but it depends obviously on what in a global scenario governance we achieve to do, especially about the production, energy, and so on. But as we are already seeing, we have the intensification and frequency of extreme weather events. There in the States, you are probably aware of the hurricanes and tornadoes, storms, and floods that you are suffering. You have there, well, as you can see, Katia, Irma, and Jose in 2017. Okay, the Florence in 2018. Droughts all around, droughts and floods around the world. We have polar waves and heat waves. All of these always becoming more frequent and more intense. Then we have the gradual and sustained increase in sea level in relation to the melting of the poles and glaciers, as we spoke a little bit before, the case of Antarctica and Greenland, the Arctic, where the Arctic is an interesting region of the world, the Arctic, to study, because already the traditional, let's say the obsolete way of thinking geopolitics is confronting this situation by the melting ice in the polar, in the Arctic pole. That's mainly an ocean. It's being disputed for all the states that are near or not that near, like China, but then you have Russia, the States, Canada, all of the countries that are around the Arctic are already on geopolitical disputes around it. But let's say it again, the traditional way of seeing politics. I invite you to put pause for a minute to this class and check this QR or the link before, and check in the city, if you are in a coastal city in the US, how it could be affected by playing with some of the variables and times. This is an interesting scenario playing situation that you can make with this. And then another of the effects, that's physical effects of climate change that are already in motion into the planetary system, and that you have been seeing with Patricia in the last class, are these ones that you can see here. We're gonna pass. And now we want to talk about the world effects of climate change. So we can see how the effects of climate change in the planetary system, in a physical way, have a direct impact on our world system. And what we are seeing is probably the inefficiencies or the shortcomings of the actual political and economic institutions to face these effects. We can see this, for instance, in our global culture of consumption that is producing in the first place the climate change causes. So the way in we live, it's causing climate change, which affects the planetary system. And these effects on the planetary system have a direct impact and consequences into the world as we know it. That's why the invitation is to start rethinking all the culture, social, political, and economic, and even the culture, the way of thinking that brought us to this situation in the first place. As the more important world effects of climate change that are related to security related risks are the ones that affect the critical infrastructure, for instance, as energy, communication, and transport. There's this these images of the subway in New York during 2012 storms that showed how a storm can paralyze the transport of a big city, of one of the most important cities of the world, being New York. So that's a good example of it. But then the effects of climate change also affect food production. There are places that won't be able to grow food, and also the water access. We have some places where there's a lack of water, like in the Lake Chad in Central Africa, where you can study this if you want, or in Cape Town in South Africa, where you can see also not only the variable of water shortages, but also how the difference between social scales can be related also to climate change effects, where some people get to the resource and some people can't get into the resource. And what's interesting about all of this is that it generates and even can exacerbate the instability and tensions between the social, political, and economic institutions within or between countries. And this can lead to potential being local, regional, or even global violent conflicts. And this is very, very important. And all of this is already causing mass migrations related to climate change and it will be causing even more migrations during the decades to come. This is something that should be a red alert for the governance institutions of today to take into account, as we'll see in a minute. And also, all of this affects, creates and increase the pressure even on international regimes and on the political actors, like states that can, there are states that can face, they don't have the resources to face the effects. So this pressure has to be taken into account. Now I invite you to put pause and watch the video, and we'll continue then. So, the European Commission in 2008, the UN General Assembly in 2009, and the IPCC in 2014 report already defined the climate change as a global risk multiplier. And what does this mean? As we've seen, and as I talked before in the world effects of climate change, we can see that it has this, this capacity of creating new tensions and conflicts and exacerbating already existing ones. And this is why it makes climate change a risk multiplier in the middle term. Here in this map, we can see different, the different hotspots that are already seen inside the planet and how it can affect, for instance, in the environmentally induced migration. This is the climate refugees or climate migrants that will be affected when their environment is affected by climate change. So, for instance, in Asia, in the area of Bangladesh, there's already being seen how the rising of the sea level and the big floods that they are suffering is already affecting a lot of people. The socio-economically lower levels of persons are being affected, and they have to move. And this is interesting to make. You've been studying Syria, and make this reflection about what happened with the Syrian refugees and how their number, that's about between 5 million persons, how it put a big pressure on the European system of receiving migrants, and it became a huge issue in the last years to receive these people. What could we do with those refugees? Now think that the more there are some models of what climate change can make in mass migration in the next 2 or 3 decades, made by for instance, for the World Bank. This is an established institution, and they say that we can expect between 50 to 150 million persons move because of climate change effects on their environment. And we have to ask ourselves what a capacity of resilience and action and way of facing this situation we actually have today. Now I invite you to put pause, watch the next video about this topic, and we'll continue our presentation into the next scenario. That's the hothouse scenario. And if we, our institutions, if the global institutions of governance today fail to address climate change in a proper way by basically changing the world order, we get our way of living, our way of consumption, our way of producing electrical energy, our way of constructing, etc., etc. Our world today, our way of transportation, You get the point. If we keep living in this world order and its way of governing itself, we might trespass the planetary boundaries that you've been learning in the classes before. And if we trespass these planetary boundaries, we might create a chain reaction that then, in which we won't have any kind of control then. This is very, very, very important to have in mind. And this might be, or is, the biggest stimulus to make a real change in our world order. Because as you can read there, if we get into this positive feedback or overshoot that accelerates the greenhouse effect on the planetary system, then we can get into a scenario never experienced before by this current civilization. And that can mean that will mean basically an existential risk for life as we know it, particularly human life in the planet. This is very, very important. I want to leave this very, very, very clear, since we are seeing some of this threshold, these tipping elements at risk. We are already seeing them advance. For instance, the coral reefs, or we saw what happened in Australia at the beginning of this year, or what happened in the Amazon rainforest last year. And we are seeing, for instance, how the permafrost is melting in Siberia, and all the experts on the subject are telling us that this sends into the atmosphere big amounts of greenhouse gases that will obviously accelerate climate change. So this scenario, unfortunately, it's not very impossible. We are walking into this scenario if we don't change path. So let's keep this in mind. And now I invite you again to see this another video, and we will move on into some of the conclusions that climate change as a geopolitical analysis gives us. So, we've been seeing during this class, to analyze the climate change from a geopolitical perspective, it gives us a broad spectrum of variables that to take into account, from the social, from the economical, from the political, and even the cultural variables that are being affected by this, by the phenomenon of climate change. So give us a broad and a big picture of the situation. And this, as you can read there in some reflections that we want to share with you, is that it gives us the opportunity, to understand the world system and the influence that it has into the planetary system, so that we don't disconnect both systems. That's maybe one of the big problems that we are facing today in the first case. That's what's bringing us into this issue. We are in motion into a new geological age called the Anthropocene, which we have to, in this new way of thinking geopolitics, we have to take into account, like we have to see the big picture of the situation, the circumstances we are into in a physical, in a planetary, in the Earth system, so that we can create a world that aligns to these circumstances. So, if this is this natural, the natural effect of climate change is created by our way of living, and it implies an existential risk. This is the biggest conclusion of all. It implies that if keeping business as usual, this is not rethinking and then not creating a new way of living and organizing ourselves, We face a global existential risk for all our civilization. And from this, I want to share also with you these reflections about how this global existential risk also represents an opportunity, a challenge for the evolution of the world system. And this is very, very, very interesting to have in mind. Like, if we are facing a global and existential risk, wouldn't it require a global and existential solution? So isn't it this an invitation to create a true governance system that can manage this situation in benefit of all humanity and the life on Earth? Isn't this a way to surpass the old self-centered and states disputes and rivalry? Maybe thinking in a selfish solidarity concept of if we don't work together, if we don't collaborate, we won't survive. So it's something like selfish solidarity stimulus, or maybe just start believing and knowing that collaboration is better than conflict. Okay, and then we have to ask ourselves how to overcome the limitations of the current system that doesn't allow us to evolve in this in the world order. I think the most clear example is about the energy production. We are still depending on fossil fuels that we know it fuel the greenhouse effect directly, and we are not utilizing the renewable energy technologies because of their own system limitations that we have to rethink. I invite you now to see another video about the risk and opportunities that climate change brings about in an economical paradigm way of thinking, and then we will talk to end this class about a little bit about the governance concept, and I will bring a new possible scenario if we really want as humanity to change path into something better. So here's the video, pause and let's go. So once we understood that the scale, and we are aware of the planetary scale of the changes that we are facing as humanity, as the Anthropocene is in motion, as we recognize that climate change is its most obvious and urgent issue that we have to start dealing with, we can bring about the concept of a global governance system. That this concept broadens the notion of government by integrating the global political and economic actors into an international and scientifically driven policies that converge to form a new conception of global politics. And this is something that invites us to rethink the actual way we are organizing geopolitics today. So the global governance system, the world order of today, is outdated because it is not able to face the new circumstances of the planetary system that the world order created in the first place. So let's have this reasoning clear so that we can see if we create a new governance system that adapts and updates to these new circumstances, we can start like creating, for instance, a plan of global action, and that this requires new models to be experimented in the world order. And in this, from this point, is that I want to share with you a concept of a resource-based economy as a possible model, because it's a global model, holistical, socio-economic and political way of thinking the world from a different perspective. That, for instance, utilizes and applies the current development in technology to create a society of abundance and creating a high standard of living for all humanity. And by applying this with an intelligent, systematic, and scientific design of the system, of this new world system, it can be related with the concerns, the social and human concerns, and with the environmental and earth system concerns. And this is something interesting because we already have all the technical tools and knowledge to create this kind of society, but there's still, as I talked in the beginning of this class, there are some conceptual thoughts, ways of thinking, raised and rooted in centuries ago, that created the institutions today, that created the problem and the global risk we are facing, and that are not able to solve these issues that created in the first instance. So all of this class of geopolitics is about rethinking the way we live in the planet. So maybe it's time to call this real work of humanity in collaboration with the scientific method as a way of creating and designing, and with the orientation of human and environmental concerns. That's something that the actual world order doesn't have into account, because it's all about consumption and making profits, particularly monetary profits, without having any concern with the social and environmental cost of this economic and social behavior of today. So I will leave you another and the last video with an introduction of a resource-based economy, so you can start digging a little bit more into this opportunity that we have to make the world order evolve into something new and better, which is more conscious and aware of the situation we live. And after this video, I would like to invite you, if you want, and if you have any doubts, or even if you want to discuss any of the topics that are given into this class or in the study guide that you'll get in the class, that's more, all of these concepts are more developed. You can contact me either in my social media via Franz Tunes, or via email by writing me. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have enjoyed this class as much as I did doing it.